It's really my pleasure to be here today. I have never really had an opportunity to work in the context that you do, but I've had an opportunity to work with children who were participating in after-school programs and critical hours programs. In my clinical experience, I was clinical coordinator for a day treatment center. And so working with youth at risk, youth presenting challenges, social and emotional challenges, behavioral challenges as well. Basically children and youth who were not able to function in the regular class setting. And so working with this population for several years, as a social worker, I had to have a perspective and a look at what is going on in these children's lives, what's going on in terms of their context for them to be struggling at the level that they are. And when we work in the field of mental health or education, we're bombarded by best practice, how-tos, strategies. This is what you do for this problem. This is what you do for that problem. But I quickly came to the realization that, and this is where this material comes into play, is it's not so much what we do, but it's who we are to these kids that matters most. So we could have the best education, we could have, the highest education level, we could have a listed training. If you look at my resume over the years, I have about like a gazillion training on there, and training is good. It's good to have professional development, but you could have all of that. If that child does not relate to you, if that child does not see you as a home base, a compass point, all of that, all of those skills are pretty much useless. Not that they don't mean anything, but they won't mean necessarily something to that child, because what matters to the child is who you are to them. Does that person like me? Can I count on them? Do they have my back? Can I go to that person when I'm feeling stressed, sad, frustrated? That's what matters. So we're in a society right now where we're very role-based. I'm the teacher, so I play the role of the teacher. I'm a youth worker, so I have a role to play. We have roles and responsibilities. I'm the principal, so this is my role. But to a child, it's not so much the role as the relationship that matters. So this is what we're going to unpack together this morning, is the importance of relationship in the learning equation. And by learning, let's keep an open mind here, and let's keep that really, really broad. It's not necessarily, as some of you have already mentioned this morning, not necessarily about learning literacy, numeracy, or science. It's learning in general, what the child takes in from his environment, from the world, and what the child can do with that. What can they generalize from that? So we'll take it a little bit above and beyond the typical learning situation here. So what I'm going to present to you today is based on an 8-hour course designed by Dr. Gordon Neufeld. Dr. Neufeld is a developmental clinical child psychologist. He's based out of Vancouver, so he is Canadian. And he's known internationally for his paradigm, which is developmental-based attachment. So we're looking at the science of relationship, and we're looking at attachment, but not in the context of something wrong with a child's attachments, not in the sense of an attachment disorder, but more in the sense of what is the role of attachment in child development, and what can we do to help foster that development. So that's the work of Dr. Neufeld, and in 90 minutes or less, I will try to cover the basis of an 8-hour course for you. But what I would like you to take away from this 90-minute is You know, what can I do concretely to foster attachment, a working attachment with the children I'm responsible for? And so we'll spend more time on that. But before we get to the how-to, I have to give you a bit of theory. So we'll look at basically the developmental, which is neuroscience based. So we'll look at what goes on in terms of the child's brain, what needs to develop there for the child to be able to learn. And then we'll look at the emotional piece of the puzzle, because emotions have a huge role to play in learning. We used to think that emotions were a nuisance, that we didn't need emotions, but now with neuroscience we know that it's at the center, it's at the core of human development and learning. So we'll look at that piece as well, and then we'll look at the attachment piece. And we'll look at how does attachment actually develops in a child. And you'll see that we're going above and beyond classical attachment theory here, which is basically the first year of life. And we're going to talk about attachment across the lifespan. Who here thinks that a 7-year-old, 9-year-old, 12-year-old, 14-year-old still needs to be attached to those in charge of them? Yeah, most of you will say yeah. And sometimes we confuse attachment with dependence, because to attach, we need to be able to depend on the person we're attaching to. But it's actually that dependence that will yield independence one day. So when we're talking about wanting our children, school-age children, to be independent, we want them to attach to us first, because then they can take our lead. Then they can find themselves, develop their sense of self, their identity, feeling like they belong, feeling like they're competent, they're capable. And then what happens? They become independent, because now they have a sense of self. But that's actually built through attachment. So we want them to depend first so that they can become independent after. So we'll talk about that as well today. The question that we're asking in this specific course is, despite the significant advances, who here works a lot with technology in mentoring students or teaching students? Yeah, so we have state-of-the-art, top-notch technology to be able to help them learn, right? Advances in pedagogy, we've never known more than what we know today in terms of how to teach a child, how to be able to impart new knowledge on a child. So a lot of advances in pedagogy as well. And curriculum, the curriculum has been greatly modified over the last 10 years with the Ministry of Education. I took part in training when they were piloting the play-based kindergarten curriculum. I provided this training to teachers, administrators, principals, because we had a new curriculum that really looked at how do children attach, and so we had to look at that. So we have all of this in 2016, but teaching is getting harder. Why is that? Why do you think that reaching out to a child, imparting knowledge to a child, teaching, translating into learning, why is that getting so difficult? Do you have any ideas? Or, I mean, for those of you who've been in the field for a long time, you might have your own theories about that. For those of you who are brand new, you might have your own ideas about that. Would you like to share those ideas right now? Yes?
There's so much distraction, like technology is so much advances in things that can distract them away from.
So we're saying distractions, so many things to sort of, get their attention going in all directions. Yes, absolutely. Yes?
Too much information for them to process.
Too much information for them to process. There is a sensory overload in terms of the brain's capacity to be able to process the information, the input. Absolutely, absolutely. Anything else?
Yes, it's hard to match the level of excitement that they get from virtual games and interactions.
It is.
To engage them.
It is. It's hard to match the level of excitement they get from being technologically stimulated, video games or even television. Absolutely, and that is a large part of youth's reality nowadays. They're connected via technology all the time, eh? We see them and they're always like, you know, they're always in front of a screen somehow, some way, yeah.
I think the technology also leads to the rest and the sleep. I mean, you know, we see a lot of our kids, it's a deficit for them. They're just not sleeping and resting enough. Or taking brain breaks even in the afternoon.
Exactly. So where do they find that psychological rest, right? If they're always stimulated by technology, absolutely. Yes?
Do like a instant gratification where, you know, instead of looking things up, it's a little harder than Google it.
Exactly. There is a generation of, I want it, oh, here's the information on how I'm going to get it, as opposed to having to think about what I need to do, what I need to work on, how much effort I need to put into this. Yeah, so there is a, I want it, oh, here it is, I got it. Yeah, Yeah. Anything else? Yes?
I feel like learning disabilities are a lot more prevalent nowadays, because for example, in challenge, a lot more education around it, so that's a difficult piece as well.
So we've seen an increase in learning disabilities or even behavioral issues.
Increase in sedentarity of children is not moving enough during the day. Yes. By the end of the day, some of them.
Yeah. Not moving enough, so that can definitely have an impact on the brain's ability to be able to take in new information. Yes.
Increase in modified sugar.
Yes, dietary changes, absolutely. And they consume a lot of more processed foods, sugary foods. Yeah, that can have an impact too. Yeah.
Well, despite all the advances in pedagogy and curriculum planning, there is still a mismatch between the way young children truly do like to learn and learn best, and what is still being provided even at the kindergarten level, and right through. The idea that play-based learning is the best way, while it's filtering into the curriculum, especially with the new one that's rolling out this year, it's still not done in practice. And that there's a significant amount of research that you disengage the child when they're most apt to be engaged, and that causes a lot of it. I teach adults at Algonquin. I get them in my class where if I don't make every single thing I say important and valuable, they don't care.
And I get you on that, because I teach, I'm not teaching right now, but I've been teaching at the college level as well. I moved on to support student success at Ottawa U. And interestingly enough, the question that we're asking ourselves in terms of student retention is that one. So we're seeing it at the university level as well. So it's not just valid for the 4, 5, 6-year-old, it's the 18, 19, 20, 25-year-old. Yeah, absolutely. And that is actually going to tie into our next section here, which is the developmental aspects. So pedagogy has to match where the child is at developmentally. And the mistake that we make is to think that because the child has this or that age, that they're chronologically or in a certain developmental stage, that the pedagogy that we have for that age group will be the right one for that child. So you could be 8 years old but have the social emotional maturity of a 4-year-old, and then that doesn't work anymore. I saw another hand. Yes.
I don't know if it's me, but I haven't seen many kids being held back anymore. So I'm working with kids that are in high school and they're not quite there, and I don't know how they got passed on. So I don't know if that's a huge issue with the kids that we see at the Boys and Girls Club, at least on my end.
Yes. So that actually, one part of the 3 developmental capacities we're going to look at might answer your question there, because when we look at one of these developmental processes that's called the adaptation process, the only way we can learn from our mistakes is by actually emotionally registering that we've hit a wall, that this doesn't work for us right now, that, oh gosh, you know, this is disappointing, this is sad, I can't believe this is happening to me, I failed my exam. And a large part of our education system right now is about not necessarily helping children register those barriers emotionally. It's let's adapt and move on. and will try to catch up next year or the year after that. So yes, in terms of their ability to adapt, they're not having as many opportunities to do so anymore, unfortunately. So we'll talk about that. Yes?
I was saying, so not having or developing the appropriate life skills.
Life skills? Yes, and that we'll talk about that. We'll touch on that very, very slightly when we talk about the first of the 3 developmental process, which is the emergent functioning. So to be able to develop life skills, you have to have a certain sense of self, right? You have to have that venturing forth energy, me do it myself, I want to learn, I want to be independent, I wanna, as opposed to I have to. When children are in the have to mode, and it's not coming from within, intrinsic motivation, it's not generally, they can learn a skill, we can teach a skill, but what we see is that it's not transferable. They're not generalizing it because it's not coming from a place of emergence, it's coming from a place of being inputted with the information, right? And if you're lucky, and that's what we noticed in day treatment, we had the best social skills programs ever in day treatment because we had all the mental health research to back it up, and we had all these wonderful, expensive programs in place. We reintegrated the child into mainstream school, regular school. What happened to their skills? Gone. They weren't able to transfer or generalize. Why? Because it wasn't coming from them. I want to make friends. I want to be nice. I want to say I'm sorry. It was sort of programmed into them. And if the child had a relationship with the social worker, the child and youth worker that was doing the program, well, they did it because they wanted to please that person. So it was more about wanting to please and wanting to me do it myself, right? So that's a good point. So you probably have many, many, many other ideas, but we'll just move on here for the sake of time. Basically, what we're stating this morning is that teaching doesn't always result into learning, despite our best effort. And we have to ask ourselves why. We have to look at what's in the way. What are the impediments for children to be able to truly learn something? And by learning here, I'm not necessarily meaning learning your multiplications by heart or things like that, but that learning that will translate and generalize into life skills, into social skills, into maturation, basically, being able to grow up. So why? We'll look at that. So the problem, and thus the answer, is not in what we are teaching, nor in how we are teaching, but rather in the declining teachability of students. And so we have to ask ourselves the questions, what renders a student teachable? Well, 3 developmental process that the child has to come to school with or to a program with to be able to learn from us. And obviously, there has to be emotional development that goes along with that. And so we'll talk about that now. So what renders students teachable? What do he or she need to bring to school? So we'll think about, I'd like you to think about 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, how many you can sort of keep in your mind, students that you work with, youth that you work with right now in your after hours program. I want you to keep these kids in mind while we go through these 3 developmental process. And feel free, afterwards I'll ask you if a few of you want to share your thoughts about these kids once we've gone through this. So you can let me know, do you think that these children have what it takes? Are they bringing these developmental capacities with them in their backpack? Are they bringing that to school with them? So the first developmental capacity is when we ask ourselves, what does the student need to bring to school to be able to learn? Well, we can ask ourselves, is that child, youth, interested and curious, right? Are they wanting to learn something? Are they curious about life? And interestingly enough, in the latest research on teachability and on the emergent process, which we're getting into now, is that kindergarten students are more curious and interested in learning than third graders. That curiosity and interest goes down for many of the reasons that you mentioned earlier on. The stimulation, the immediate gratification, there's many things that come into play here, but a preschooler is more curious than a third grader. So what kind of problems are we going to find if that curiosity goes down, if we're declining in curiosity? What's going to happen in terms of that student's learning? Any ideas? I'll just say one word, and I'm sure you're going to relate to that. Boring, right? How many students do you hear say, "This is boring. I'm bored." Exactly, right. Because when that curiosity and interest dives down, everything becomes boring. Even a video game becomes boring after 5-10 minutes because there's not that capacity to want to discover things. So wanting to try new things. A lot of students, a lot of children nowadays are so reluctant to take risks with their learning. They're so reluctant, and I'm not talking about here math and literacy and things like that. I'm talking about trying to maybe express an opinion that's different from what they're reading. So that kind of wanting to try new things, they're going to stick with what they know and what is familiar. There's a huge problem in terms of trying to get them to think outside the box. Thinking for oneself too, you know, having their own opinions, their own ideas. They struggle with that immensely, yes.
But isn't that a direct result of a society that's created an overprotective layer on children where we don't let them fail? We don't give them the opportunity to fail. They lose that resiliency to bounce back from having failure in their lives. So why would they even bother to try? If my mommy and daddy are going to protect me, or the teachers are going to never let me feel a sense of failure because I'm not given that opportunity to do that, I'll just wait for you to tell me when to do it, what to do it, how to do it. Why would I think for myself if you're going to tell me anyway?
Okay, yes, fair enough. And that could definitely be part of it. That could be part of the lack of emergent functioning that we see in youth nowadays. Absolutely. So thinking for oneself, there seems to be a bit of a struggle with that. What we also see is that children nowadays tend to lose contact with their home base. There's a phenomenon that Dr. Neufeld talks about called peer orientation. We have this big push in our society for early independence, early socialization. That can come at a cost. If children become more attached to their peers at a young age than they are to those adults in charge, who are they going to take their cues from? Yeah. Now, children raising children, children educating children, not a good idea, right? And then it becomes extremely difficult for the adults in charge, the teachers, the youth workers, the counselors, to be able to reach, to get in, right? I don't need your opinion and your ideas. I got my friends, you know, they're my boo, you know, they're my peeps, and they know best, right? You don't know nothing. So there's that phenomenon too that we see, which makes it very difficult for them to think for themselves. There's no sense of self. There's a sense of, I have me and my group, but there's no sense of being able to be with and still be me. So togetherness without the loss of separateness. So they're really challenged in terms of thinking for themselves, having plans, goals, aspirations, filling solitude with creative endeavors, valuing originality, creativity, being self-directed in their learning, right? We see that too. There is a push in education right now for self-directed learning, but students struggle with that. Not because they don't have the capacity, but because they lack emergent functioning to be able to be self-directed. In academic advising at the university level, this is what we're trying to develop in students who struggle: self-directed learning, self-authorship. You know, we coach and we partner up to help them foster and develop their own problem solving and their own solutions. This is at the university level, when in fact children have the potential to do this at the elementary level, but they come to university and they still can't do that. They struggle with that. So this is what we call the emergent process. The emergent process is a developmental process that usually starts in about the first, well, it's not that it starts there, but we can see evidence of it in the 1st to 2nd year of life. And it's directly tied to that child's attachments. So if there is a sense of safety for the child, if the child feels safe with his primary attachment figures, then there's going to be around 1 to 2 years of life this desire to venture forth. We'll see the bungee cord, the attachment umbilical cord, stretch further, right? So they'll go out into their environment, that's probably the household, and they'll explore, open doors, cupboards, get everything out, right? They explore, and in the preschool age, we now see there's a big tendency for what we call emergent play, right? We want them to be emergent. We want them to play on their own with, in terms of their imagination, using creativity, and there's a big push for emergent play. Well, for that, you have to have good emergent functioning. You have to have that ability to trust and feel safe to be able to venture forth and explore. Now let's take that at the school age and adolescent levels. Do you see a decline in school age and adolescence in terms of their ability to venture forth, to feel safe in their environments? Or is there more a sense now of not feeling safe? So the statistic in Ontario right now in mental health is 1 in 5. 1 in 5 child, if we were to granny talk it, 1 in 5 child does not feel safe, does not have a sense of self, and does not venture forth. No emergent functioning. How many children does that represent statistically in the groups you work with?
I can say as the funder, I mean, that's where homework clubs are, is in communities which there are rational reasons for children not to feel safe, and in families where sometimes, not always, there are rational reasons not to feel safe.
Exactly. Yeah, it makes sense.
That's why these programs exist.
Exactly. So most of the children, would it be a fair assumption then to say most of the children that you see in your programs, that sense of safety and sense of self is vulnerable, fragile, missing, lacking? Yeah. Okay. All right. So, but what we know in neuroscience is that that's what a child needs to be able to learn. They need to have a sense of self. They need to have a sense of self to be able to be interested and curious, to want to try new things, to think for oneself, to be full of plans and aspirations, to fill solitude with creative endeavors, be self-directed, assume responsibility for one's actions is also a direct link with emergent process. Seeing options and choices in life. Oh, I could do this, but wait a minute, I could also maybe do that. I hadn't thought about that. Oh, I have options now. So valuing uniqueness and differences. I'm my own person, I'm unique, but there's people that are different from me, and that's okay. I value differences. Be rarely bored. Be full of vitality, seeking autonomy and independence. And that doesn't mean that the child is independent yet, but they're seeking. And again, we see that in toddlers and preschoolers when this comes on full blown for them, developmentally speaking, it's that energy of me, do it myself, right? And if we try to insist too much on form, here, I'll show you how to do it. You were referring to that earlier. Well, it's not coming from the child anymore, it's coming from us. So the idea is that we can use play to foster that sense of me, do it myself, that sense of I want to become independent. But still, the child still needs to have a home base, and we'll talk about that. So the 3 vectors that we're talking about here in terms of the emergent process is vitality. Can I be my own person outside of my attachment relationships, outside of my village of attachment? For the 2-year-old, that means venturing off in the kitchen to you know, just open those cupboards up and get everything out. For the school-age child, it means I can go to school and still feel safe even though I'm no longer at home. For the adolescent, this means I can become myself now. I can find myself, my identity. The viability, again, is being able to be one's own person without the influence of other people. It doesn't mean that they're not influenced, but it means that they don't necessarily going to modify who they are based on other people's influence. So in the last 20 years, we've been researching a lot the phenomenon of peer orientation, as I had mentioned, and sort of peer influence, right? And we often talk about how peers influence each other. Well, a child who's got good emergent functioning, it's not that that child won't be influenced, but that child's going to be able to analyze under the influence of others whether or not it's a good idea to proceed, because they have their own opinions and ideas about that. And so that's what we don't see as much anymore. Children influence each other a great deal nowadays. And so this is an emergent child. This is what we need to be successful at school. But what happens if the child doesn't have that? Then we have problems in terms of their ability to learn. I am just going to put this up here really, really quickly in terms of giving you an idea of what emergent pedagogy looks like. We used to have that type of pedagogy in schools before. Play-based kindergarten would be an example of emergent pedagogy. So these are things that we can do in our relationships with students. Again, this is not necessarily just for teachers. This is anybody relating to a child in the context of a learning or social situation, because the social contexts are also learning contexts. So making room for initiative, what do you think about that? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I'd like to hear your opinion on that. Placing them in charge of their learning wherever possible. We can do some of that. Providing options, soliciting intentions to get them in the driver's seat, to help them to foster a sense of agency and responsibility. Where would you like to go with that? Let's look at your goals, and we're really good at goal setting in the education system. We can give interest the lead when providing information, so we can draw out their interest and we can show interest in it too. Because if they're attached to us, if we're interested, there's a good chance that they will be too. Giving questions the lead when providing answers. This is, an old technique. I think it's called the Socratic technique, right? Answering a question with a question, right? So the child comes to you with a question, and instead of giving them the answer, you ask them a question to help them reflect and try to come up with an answer, right? So that's another way of doing it. And to provide opportunities for experimentation and exploration. And this one is big, and this is a shocker in terms of the emergent functioning, is try to be careful about praise. There was a comment earlier about it's the instant gratification. They want something, they get it right away, right? Well, the problem with praise is that it really shoots down the emergent process, because the child is no longer doing it for himself, he's doing it for the reward. So it's not that we shouldn't praise, but we should praise relationship and not behavior or outcomes, right? Instead of saying good work, sticker stamp, or prize, we could say, I really like seeing you work hard like that. This is amazing to see you do this, you know? And you want to bring it back at the relationship level so that it fosters attachment as opposed to fostering a motivation to get more and more and more.
Yes. I was just going to say, I think you've been giving the child feedback on is just use artwork, they'll make a drawing. A lot of parents will go over the top and say, that's wonderful. And then it desensitizes the child to when they actually do a good job versus when they do put minimal effort into their work.
Right.
You have to be careful not only with praise, but critical feedback that needs to be meaningful.
Exactly. It needs to be constructive and meaningful. Absolutely, absolutely. And it's not that praise is not a good thing, but we've gone overboard with it. That's the point. And so children are operating out of external motivation. And when that motivation is no longer enough to get them interested, right? We were talking about earlier, you know, having a hard time competing with what we call, and when we look at it from a neuroscience perspective, it's the reward circuitry in the brain, right? It's like going for that chocolate bar when you know you shouldn't. It's like, you know, going on a diet but cheating. That reward circuitry, the more it gets triggered, the more behavior is driven towards that. So the more we reward in the sense of tangible rewards, getting children to work for the reward, well, the more they get hungry for that. And it's not about learning from a place of curiosity and interest anymore. It's coming from a place of give me, give me, give me. I want more. Give me more sugar. Give me more caffeine. Give me more. It becomes sort of addictive, actually, for them. And then we have to keep, this is costly, because that sticker doesn't work anymore. So now we have to have programs with tangible rewards. We have to invest money in buying things. And so this can really affect the capacity to become emergent in the learning. There's a second developmental process. This one is a very, very significant one in the teachability factor. It's called the adaptive process. In the adaptive process, someone mentioned resiliency earlier. The adaptive process is actually the underpinning of resiliency. If we have a brain who is able to adapt to things we cannot change, Dr. Neufeld calls them futilities. Futility, I think, is an old word that means you've come up against something that you cannot change and there's nothing you can do about it. It's futile, it's useless, it's not going to work. When children learn to accept those futilities of life, they adapt. When they adapt, they develop resiliency. When they develop resiliency, this is not a skill. This is a brain mechanism in the limbic system. It's actually based in our emotions. Resiliency is an emotional process that will help that child be able to overcome many, many adverse situations. It can be in the learning context. It can be learning to accept our mistakes and failures. Do you work with students, with children who have a really hard time seeing their mistake, seeing the error of their ways, and then they just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again? Even socially, right? They fail to learn that this behavior pushes friends away instead of inviting them in, but they just keep Keep doing it over and over again. These are children who are non-adaptive. They lack in the ability to adapt. Their adaptive functioning is compromised. So when the adaptive process is working well, what we have is an ability to learn from mistakes and failures, a benefit from correction. So when we correct the child, when we say, oh, look, you made a mistake here, that's not the right way, let's look at this together and see if we can make it better, they can actually learn from that. Realizing the futility of a course of action. No, hitting your friends is not going to work for you. You're just going to keep getting yourself into trouble. We'll have to find a different way of expressing your frustration. Then they can learn from that. They can become resourceful, resilient, benefit from adversity. When we have a highly adaptive population, and we have in this day and age populations who are highly adaptive, who can overcome highly traumatic incidents. Do you have any examples of that? Refugees. If the adaptive functioning and capacity of refugees is there, it's amazing what they can overcome. Veterans, war veterans. Yeah. What happens to a war veteran who has a compromised adaptive process? The PTSD. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean that someone who's highly adaptive won't struggle. They will struggle, but the brain will find a workaround to adapt to that. And there's a pathway in the brain for that, in the limbic system. And that's when the child or the individual can register two emotions that are related to the adaptive process. When they can register these two emotions and actually feel them, because it's one thing to be able to say, oh, I feel sad, but it's another thing to say, I feel so sad right now. This doesn't work for me. When the child is able to register emotionally sadness and disappointment, when he or she is up against something they cannot change, that kickstarts the adaptive process. Now again, this is attachment related. If the child is in an environment where it's not safe to feel sad and disappointed, the brain will sacrifice emotional development for survival purposes. That brain is going to tell the child, you're not going to feel sad or disappointed, because if you do, you risk not surviving this, right? And so we have many children whose adaptive functioning is compromised from an early age on. And then when they get to more structured programs, they really struggle at accepting no's, limits, why we need to do things a certain way, class rules, social convention, how to behave in a social situation, and so on. You had a...
Sorry, it's also due to children on the spectrum.
Children who are born with a sensitive brain, their adaptive functioning is compromised from the get-go. So, not due to the attachment. No, exactly. Well, yes and no. It's not a matter of having an attachment that is not good. It's more a matter of the brain not being able to respond to that attachment in a way that would foster the adaptive process. Children with autism, children on the autism spectrum, children with sensory integration problems, some children with attention deficit hyperactivity, they really struggle at feeling their emotions because it's too vulnerable for the brain. And so if they don't feel it, then they can't attach at those deep levels that we'll talk about in a few minutes, that they need to be able to fully develop that way. So it's not about the quality of the attachment, but more so the brain's challenges in actually attaching to that person. A child who has good adaptive functioning could have a whole lot of things working against them, but they would still be able to overcome all of these things. It could be a disability, it could be a learning difficulty or problem. It could be maybe some lacks and losses in their personal lives. It could be not being the most popular kid in school. It could be, you know, losing their dog, their grandmother. It could be a variety of things that children have to adapt to nowadays. If the adaptive process is there, if it's functional, then it's not going to be easy. I'm not saying they're going to smooth sail right through it. This is not necessarily about, you know, positive psychology and think positive and everything will be happy and sunny, but it's more about having the capacity, the ability to overcome these situations. And when children are able to do that, their learning capacity is 10 times greater than a child who's non-adaptive, because they can learn from their mistakes and their failures. They can feel sadness and disappointment when they fail a test, or when a friend says, I don't want to play with you today, maybe tomorrow, and so on. Yeah, I think you had a question?
Yeah, and you might get into it, I'm not sure, but short of removing them from the environment that's deemed as unsafe or not safe, how would you reconcile so they could, you know?
Good question. And yes, we will get into that. The research shows, and this was mentioned, I think, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, it takes just one attachment. It can be outside the home. It takes just one significant relationship in that child's life for that process to get unstuck. So if the child's adaptive process got stuck along the way, if they go to a program where they connect with one adult in charge, where they feel safe, they feel wanted, they feel loved, cared for, understood, and that doesn't mean that we say yes to everything and we don't set limits. No, it means that they feel taken care of. Then that could be just what they need to be able, for the brain to be able to find a different pathway and kickstart that adaptive process again. So we have a huge role in that sense, because we're often that home base away from home. And when I mean away from home, I don't necessarily mean just physically away, but sometimes it's emotionally or psychologically, if the conditions at home are not the right conditions to foster this development. It takes just one. When we, I can't remember because there's so many information out there, but there is a longitudinal research that was done on adults who were in the foster care system. And when the researchers asked them because these were adults who had a certain level of success in their life, when they asked them what had made the difference for them, they didn't necessarily remember the name, but they could say, it was my grade 3 teacher. And when we would ask them why or it was my mentor or my big brother, you know, the big brother, big sisters. And when we asked them, well, what did they do that made the difference? Well, that person was always there for me. They had my back. They understood me, and they helped me. That's attachment, right? They couldn't label it that way, but that's attachment. So obviously this is best when it's homegrown, when it's done at home, but when it's not possible for different reasons, then we're it. Teachers, child and youth workers, program consultants, or people who are there to greet the kids at different periods of their day, of their week, of their school year, of their summers. Summer camp is a big one. So yeah, that's us. We're agents of attachments. And so what happens in the brain in terms of the adaptive process is when the child encounters that futility, right? It's the equivalent in terms of the brain of coming up against a wall. So there's no more transmission going on up there, no communication, the pathways we have a roadblock, right? So in terms of the brain and how it works is what needs to happen is when that happens, when the brain hits that roadblock, Sorry, you can't have that cookie before dinner. Mommy said no, and I'm not going to change my mind. We were talking earlier about, setting limits and being able to say no and being that agent of futility. When we're the teacher who says, I'm sorry, but this is the grade that you got. I know that's not what you wanted, but that's the grade that you got. I'll help you work on it if you want, but I know it's sad right now. You're disappointed in that. So when we're able to do that and the brain hits that wall, if the brain's not too defended, we'll talk about defenses in a minute. If the brain's not too defended, what's going to happen is that it's going to signal the limbic system in the brain, which is our primitive brain. And the limbic system will signal the amygdala, which is that little part of the limbic system that's responsible for attachment and emotions. And the amygdala will signal the lacrimal glands. Lacrimal glands are responsible for our tears. And so the child will be moved to tears because there's nothing left to do but cry. When they encounter a futility, a limit, and the brain is able to go, okay, this is sad, man. This is so disappointing right now. And you can actually see the shift in them. They go from frustration to, right? And that's when you know, okay, the brain is working here. The adaptive process is working here. But for that, here's the caveat. For that to happen, it has to feel safe. So if the child doesn't feel safe at home, but they feel safe with us after school or in our programs, this might be the context where this is going to happen. So we have to be able to foster that, to invite that, to say, to normalize it. It's okay to be disappointed, man. It's I can see why you're sad about this. Oh, I feel sad too sometimes when something like that happens to me. We have to convey that it is safe and okay to feel vulnerable. It's okay to be sad and disappointed. We don't have to be tough and all mighty all the time. And if we can do that, then maybe that adaptive process wasn't working before, but it has a chance to work now, because when the child has a safe place to find his tears about what doesn't work, then we have a brain who can find a workaround and who can start adapting and become resilient. So that's sort of the neurobiology of it. So I'm not suggesting here, so when a child is non-adaptive, there's none of that. I'm not suggesting here that in your programs you should make children cry. Come on, let's have a good cry. It might not feel entirely safe in a program like that to find our real tears, not because we're not feeling safe with the adults in charge, but because there's like a gazillion other children around, and the brain might go, whoa, wait a minute, we can't do that here. I don't feel comfortable doing that. So it's not about getting them to actually, but it's about just helping them touch a little bit, resonate with the feeling of sadness and disappointment. If they can feel it a little bit, wiggle into it a little bit, and feel that it's safe to do so in the relationship with you, then bingo, the job is done. And the beauty of this, of what we know now with neuroscience, is that this can actually be the best way for children to grieve the bigger lacks and losses in their lives. We don't even have to talk about these things directly anymore. It used to be in trauma treatment, it was direct. Tell me all about your lacks and losses. Oh, your mommy abandoned you. How do you feel about that? Right? We don't even have to process that anymore. If we process it indirectly, sometimes what I do with highly non-adaptive and defended kids, stories and movies. The movie Inside Out, beautiful movie to convey that feelings can be your friends, even sadness, right? So we can do it indirectly, but the idea is to be able to get them back in touch with those feelings of sadness in very non-vulnerable ways. Yes?
I was going to ask, you touched on real tears. Is there a difference between real tears and fake tears? And if there is, how do you see it?
Absolutely. With real tears of sadness, you see a discharge. There's an emotional discharge. There's a shift in body in body disposition. You go from stiff to soft kind of thing, right? It's like grieving, yeah? When you come to that still point that you realize that, okay, that person or thing or situation will never be there again, and you start crying about it. Very different from tears of frustration that you'll see in the tantrum or in the meltdown or outburst. Tears cried to onions, obviously. But there's other kinds of tears that are not tears of adaptation. The difference is measured in the chemicals released in the tears. So if you actually collected tears of sadness, it's potent enough in terms of cortisol. If you were to reduce that to a powdered substance, you could kill a small rodent. So a rodent, a rat, or a small animal. Yep, absolutely. So when you're actually releasing tears of sadness, you're releasing chemicals, toxic chemicals in the brain.
There's this really cool picture online. I don't know if you've seen it or if it's true, and I'd love to know if you did see it and if it's true. But there's 4 pictures. It's tears under a microscope, and it's different types of tears, and they all look so different.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's true. No, their chemical composition is different. And the ones we're looking for are the sadness and disappointment, because that's limbic system, amygdala based tears. It's not frustration. It's not, it's coming from a different place. So when it comes from that place of the amygdala and the limbic system, it has the possibility to create new pathways in the brain that can then connect that information to the prefrontal cortex, which we'll talk about now. Looking at the time like, whoa. And actually help the child learn from that, right? Learn that it's okay to be sad, it's okay to be disappointed. I made a mistake, but I can try again. And there you get all of those wonderful sort of characteristics that was on the previous slides there of the emergent process. There was a hand up, I think. Yes.
Hi. My background is in music education.
Oh, yes.
Young children.
Yes.
Up to there's recently been quite a lot of research with conservatory, Toronto Conservatory of Music, exactly on the developing brain, on the effect of, in this case, musical learning, and relating that to student success, basically. So I'm fascinated hearing the research that you're sharing. Wanting to share as well that 25 years I've been working with young kids in musical and artistic learning. That emotional, safe place that allows them to grow. Every music educator knows this right from the get-go. And those students often develop a relationship with those who are teaching them for many years. As a kid, my first music teacher, I met her at 6. I left her when I was 18.
There you go.
Right, so emotionally, and she saw me develop. Right, she helped me grow. So I'm thinking of these kids that have difficulty with understanding their own emotional development, with emotional intelligence, and where and how do they go to when, that frustration or that sadness or that anger or that, gee, I'm so happy, I just want to tell somebody. Musical expression and musical learning for kids does a lot of that.
Yeah, it does.
Right? Having a sad day, I can't wait to play my sad song piece of music, right? It validates that emotional state that they're in, and it's cathartic. It's actually a healing.
Absolutely.
So that becomes their safe place.
It becomes a safe place, and it becomes their segue to tears. They don't have, They don't have to actually cry while they're playing it to register sadness and disappointment emotionally in the limbic system. Music will do that for them. It can be music, it can be arts, expressive writing. We just have to find that, which one of these sort of mediums will lend itself for any particular child to help support that. So that's exactly a good example of how we can foster the adaptive process, facilitate it, help a child get unstuck without having to do counseling or therapy with that child. That's not our role. And besides, we're now realizing that's not all that helpful to tackle that on directly either, because it evokes a lot of defendedness in their little brains. They can't process, so the brain shuts it down. So that's even better to do it indirectly. Music, arts, expressive writing, books, stories, with the wee little ones. And I see Michelle at the back there with the Head Start programs. We had talked about how to bring in children's literature in the daycare settings that would help children start being more attuned with feelings without it being their own. We're not talking about your sadness about your mommy and daddy splitting up, but we're going to be talking about this story that talks about sadness and disappointment when we lose something, right? So we can definitely, as educators, as mentors, if we're that safe place, that home base, we can foster that, facilitate that in so many different ways. And most of the time, and that's the good news, we do that. We just don't know that that's what we're doing, right? But now that we know this, we go, oh my gosh, the possibilities are infinite. And is that infinite? Yeah, got it. Sometimes my French brain kicks in and I mix up words. But yeah, the possibilities are infinite. But the bottom line is you have to have that home base first, because if I just say, I'll teach you music, but you've got no connection with that child, it's not necessarily going to have the same impact. The child may still learn music, but it won't necessarily have the same impact emotionally. But if you have a connection and you want to impart your knowledge, your values, your own feelings about the beauty of music, you have a door this big to have this become, a safe place for the child to feel and express sadness and disappointment, or any other kind of intense feelings. Absolutely, absolutely. So we'll move on. We have some examples here of adaptive pedagogy, but I'm going to skip that so that we can talk briefly about the last one. So the integrative process is the third developmental process that is required that a student has to bring to school or to a program to be able to learn. We talked about the emergent and the adaptive. Now it's the integrative process. The integrative process is our ability, and you have all the examples here of what it represents. I won't go into each of them in detail, but integration is our ability to mix opposition inside the brain. So in learning theories, we call it cognitive dissonance, right? Oh, I have this thought, oh, but there's also this thought that is opposite to my first thought. Oh, look at that. I'm conflicted because I thought this was the ultimate truth, and now I'm being presented with this perspective, and all of a sudden, what I thought is no longer necessarily what is real. And so we have the ability to think twice about things. So that's on the cognitive level. On the emotional level, this is where oftentimes children will get stuck in terms of their integrative functioning. On the emotional level, it's the ability to mix conflicting emotions. Okay? And when we can mix conflicting emotions, I'll give you an example, but when we can mix conflicting emotions, the brain is able to do the following: impulse control, emotional regulation, that's a big thing out there now, right? Self-regulation, emotional regulation, problem solving. So we call that executive functioning. It's the prefrontal cortex that's responsible for that. But it has to happen at the emotional level as well. So I'll give you an example. You have a child who wants to hit out of frustration. So what's the first emotion that comes up for that child? Anger. Anger, frustration. I want to hit you, right? So if they have any integrative capacity or integrative functioning, then when that emotion comes up, another one should come up right after that is the opposite of frustration or anger. What would be an opposite emotion to frustration and anger? Compassion, caring, right? So you have a student who, or a child who wants to hit another child. Oh, I really want to hit you right now. You did this to me. I really want to, I want to hit you. I'm frustrated. But at the same time, I care. You're my friend. I don't want to hurt you. Or if the child doesn't really care about the other child because maybe it's their worst enemy, maybe they care enough about themselves to care about the outcome of their actions. I want to hit you right now, but I care about what's going to happen to me. If I hit you, I'm going to get into trouble. I don't want that. You're the one who's being a not nice person. I won't use the word that they use usually because I'm being filmed. But, but if they care about themselves or care about outcomes, but I don't want my teacher to be mad at me or my mom to be mad at me, then they're mixing opposite feelings. When the brain's able to do that, then we have impulse control, emotional regulation, and problem solving. And those are hugely necessary in the learning equation. Because what do we ask children to do when they're learning? Control your impulses and your desire to the otherwise than learning, right? Regulate yourself and problem solve. That's what we ask. That's what our pedagogy is based on. So to learn, children need to have the capacity to mix opposite feelings. So here's the problem with the integrative process. This is actually called the orthogenetic principle. It's by an author called Otto Rank. Emotional integration precedes social integration. So what does that mean? What does that tell us? A child has to have the ability to mix opposite feelings before they can mix with others socially. Because if I can't mix my own feelings, I won't be able to take into consideration someone else's feelings. So it has to happen at the personal, emotional level before it can happen at the social level. So if we have a child who's struggling with integration, we're going to have a child who's struggling with socialization. Big time, big time. And the not so good news about this process is that integration only happens between the ages of 5 to 7 years of age, because that's when we now know that the prefrontal cortex of the brain gets activated. Before that, there is no capacity to mix, not at the emotional level. Maybe at the cellular and sensory, maybe a little bit of cognitive dissonance in the preschool, later preschool years, but really not that much. It's only between 5 to 7 years. And this was actually put out there initially by Piaget, but he really stated it at the cognitive level. Now we understand it in neuroscience at the emotional level, and we know that this is not possible. The prefrontal cortex is not wired for this until 5 to 7 years of age. That's brain development. And oftentimes we expect this of children who are 2 and 3 and 4. So that causes a difficulty in learning for them, because we're expecting something of them that is beyond their developmental capacity. So in terms of the pedagogy, if we're working with children who are older than the 5 to 7 years, and we are a home base, we are that safe place for that child, we can prime that process. We can help children see both this and that at the same time. Or at least we can start introducing opposite feelings to them. You know, when we're doing problem solving with a child who's, you know, getting into trouble for something, and we recognize the frustration that they feel, and we come alongside that, and that child goes, oh yeah, I'm so frustrated right now, I could just kill him, I just want to kill him. Oh, that's a lot of frustration in you if you want to kill him. I can see that you're really frustrated. But I also wonder, you know, if you care about what's going to happen to you if you do kill him. Like, what's the outcome of that? You know, and you want to draw out that opposite. And as educators and mentors, we're the perfect people to do that, because it's part of the learning process, right? And maybe we do it already, we just didn't know the impact that this has. So this is something we can definitely do, is use that, that integrative pedagogy. But what happens if we're dealing with children, and some of the children that we work with are non-emergent, non-adaptive, non-integrative. So they're school-aged children with the social and emotional development of a preschooler. They never outgrew the preschooler stages socially and emotionally. Why does that happen? Well, we already talked about it a little bit, but the bottom line is that the engine of maturation for brain development to occur, a child has to be able to feel vulnerable feelings. We have to be able to feel our sadness, our disappointment, feel scared. Here's a big one, missing. I miss, you know, feeling that void. I miss my mom right now. I miss my dad. I miss my friend. I miss, I can't remember your name, sorry. No, Nora, you mentioned earlier, you know, the 6-year-old you encounter, right? He wasn't able to say, I missed you, where were you? Instead, he was like, why are you talking to me? You have no right to talk to me, you abandoned me, right? So these tender, vulnerable feelings, they need to be felt for the brain to develop. Otherwise, the brain will stay at the status quo of what is tolerable for the child. So this is why some children get stuck. And when they do get stuck, then they harden up. They become emotionally and perceptually desensitized. So they no longer feel the sadness and disappointment they should feel when a friend says, I don't want to play with you. They no longer see when a friend is signaling, you're not welcome in this group right now, right? We don't want you here. So they are emotionally numbed out, perceptually desensitized. And what happens? They get themselves into trouble all over the place because they can't feel and they can't see what's going on. And so these children, it doesn't matter how old they are. They're really operating at the level of preschoolers in terms of social and emotional development. I work with adults who haven't necessarily gone beyond the preschooler phase in terms of of the 3 developmental processes we're talking about here this morning. Now, that doesn't mean that that individual cannot have some sort of success in life. I'll give you an example. I'll just say the name and I think we'll understand here. Donald Trump. Who's more successful than that? Who's the biggest preschooler you know in his 50s or 60s? There you go. So we all grow older, but we don't all grow up. And what prevents us from growing up is if we can't feel the emotions that we need to feel to grow us up. So the issue becomes here, children who fail to feel their emotions will also fail to attach at the proper levels to become independent and functional. Because in order to attach deeply, you have to be able to feel. Think about the first time you fell in love. How vulnerable did you feel? And if you didn't feel vulnerable, well, then you probably could go, right? Don't really need you, don't care about you. But attachment, relationship, when they're deep and meaningful, they're also very vulnerable. So you have to have a capacity for vulnerable feelings. Many of our children today don't feel anymore. They lost their feelings. And you see this in their demeanor, in their behavior. I don't care, whatever. Consequence, bring it on. I don't care what you do to me anymore, right? They lost the ability to care. And that's a huge problem because we need to care in order to learn. If we don't care, we can't learn. Nothing is going to stick because it's going to be met with a system of defenses that is not going to allow anything that feels vulnerable. Learning is vulnerable. When you're learning something new, what kind of emotions would that evoke? I'm in a new job right now. I've taken on this contract. I love challenges, and sometimes I think either I'm either very self-authorshipy or stupid. Depends on the day and how I feel. So I've taken on this new contract right now with the student success at Ottawa U. And this is a huge learning curve for me. Although I was teaching at the college level, now I'm in the world of academia. And what I have to offer, I have to sort of tone down and adapt to the world of academia, right? It's really hard to teach university professors how to change their practice and how to do things better. So I'm feeling extremely vulnerable right now. If I wasn't able to allow myself to feel that vulnerability, what would happen to me in that situation? Yeah, I'd fail big time. Or I'd be completely oblivious to the fact that I'm not succeeding, right? So vulnerable feelings are absolutely necessary. They have to be felt in order to move us. Now, my vulnerability right now is telling me tread cautiously. My alarm system right now is through the roof, but it's telling me, be careful, move to caution. This is unknown territory, slippery slope. You know, you can't just walk in there like you used to and, you know, do your thing. You have to adapt, right? But if I don't feel vulnerable, that's what I'm going to do. Walk in there and bulldoze in there and tell them how to do their jobs and then get told many, many things that I might not be ready to hear, right? So vulnerability and emotions help us adapt. They help us move. They help us grow up. And a lot of our children have lost that. So this is what we're left with when we're looking at learning and behavior problems. When we look at the actual sort of iceberg of things, you know, we may have children who are born that way, highly sensitive, autism spectrum. Or we might have children who are highly defended. They no longer feel or care about what happens to them. Or we might have children who are completely missing the pivotal feelings that they need to be able to mature. They may be stuck developmentally. They may be 10, 12, 15, 30, 50 years old, but are still really operating emotionally and socially at the level of a 4 or 5-year-old. What we see are the symptoms and outcomes of that. We see learning and behavior problems. Yes?
This really resonates with me because like when I worked at the homework club, like a lot of times the boys were the ones to act out the most. And I feel like that says a lot about our society and how they tell boys, you know, to man up, to suck it up, to not cry, you know, never show your vulnerability and just always be strong. But so they never really learn how to like kind of experience those feelings. Yeah. So when they come to like the homework club, it was like they just were in control. They didn't listen to nobody. Yeah. It's like a group, like a cohort of them, but that like really resonates with what you're saying. There.
Yeah. And we used to work with children like that. We call this, Dr. Neufeld calls this the alpha complex, where children need to be in control, in the lead. They're bossy, prescriptive, demanding. They have to have the last word. They are in charge of their relationships. I'll tell you if, where, and when. I want you to look at me, help me, give me a hug, a high five. And for children like that, we really, really have to focus on attachment. We have to flip it around. We have to create scenarios where they have no choice but to depend on us. What we used to do way back when, 15 years ago, and we didn't even know this stuff. So we didn't know that's what we were doing, but I guess intuitively we knew, is we would go on experiential camping trips with these kids. Remove them from where they could control everything and put them in an environment for a couple of weeks where they had no choice but to depend on us. And we really reversed those instincts. We reversed instincts to want to be in charge and control with instincts to depend and look up to and rely upon. And so I'm not suggesting that that's what you have to do with your programs. Take them out into the woods for 2 weeks. But you can see how creative you can get with this concept, right, of having activities that they know nothing about because all they know is this. So if all your activities are this, well, we're not really reversing anything. But if you get something there that they don't know anything about, that they sort of have to look up to you to learn how to do it, well, you're kind of creating these scenarios where you can sort of flip that around. But again, your bottom line is, am I a home base for that child? Do I have a relationship with that child? Because if I don't, even if I have the best attachment void activity that I can come up with, it's probably not going to work as much as I would like it to. So I have to have that attachment first. So if we don't have any of these three capacities for learning, then I'm just gonna skip forward the. So if we don't have these, I'm going to skip forward a few slides here just to touch on attachment for the last 5 minutes. If we don't have these three built-in or developmental capacities in children, and keep in mind that we can't teach a child to be curious and to be emergent. We can't teach a child to adapt. We can't teach them to have mixed feelings, but we can help them develop these three developmental processes in the context of safety. And I think this ties in really well with your pillars. You know, if we're a safe place, a home base for these children, then we can help them get unstuck, and these three developmental processes will unfold because it's part of nature's plan. The potential is there. It's there in every child, but it gets stuck, right? It's like gardening. We need to remove the impediments, remove the weeds and everything else so that the flower, the plant can grow. And how does a plant grow? Well, there's 6 stages or phases to human attachment or human relationships. So we go way beyond the baby bonding here. The first one would be the equivalent of the baby bonding, but it's also there in our adult relationships when we meet someone new for the first time. So the first way that we attach is through senses. This even starts happening before birth. By the 6th month of pregnancy, second semester? I had 3 and I always mix that up. I had 3 kids. We have 3 semesters in a trimesters, yes, sorry. There goes my French brain again. You can't do 3 with semester, it's semesters too. So in the 2nd trimester of pregnancy, baby is already attached to mom through senses. Which senses are evoked here in terms of sound? Can recognize and differentiate mother's voice from other sounds that he or she hears, that the baby hears, yeah. Touch. Can recognize when mom's touching the tummy or someone else is touching it, and the baby will respond very differently to that touch. Smile with the mama touch. Smile, maybe. It'd be nice to take a picture in there and see what sort of physiological reaction is going on, but we know that it helps develop the fetus's brain. The brain is developing when there's that sense of connection through the senses. And this goes on in the first year of life, attaching through sight, through sound, through smell. How does this apply to the kids that we work with and to ourselves as adults? How do we seek to be with when we've had a hard day? When we're feeling sad, frustrated, what do we look for? What do we seek? What is our human instinct? Let's say you had a really, really bad day and you go home to your loved ones. What are you looking for? A hug, yeah. Senses, right? This is where we retreat back to that because this is what feels good. The problem with senses is it doesn't last. It doesn't carry us through a whole day at school or a whole week away on a trip somewhere because it's instant gratification, a hug, a kiss. But young children really, really, really seek that way of attaching. How does this apply to the kids you work with? Eye contact. Your smile, the warmth in your voice, the twinkle in your eye when you greet them. You can invite the kids you work with to attach to you through senses. Feed them, Food is the best way to invite a child to attach to you. Feed them. That's what we do in our critical hours, after hours program. At school, we feed them breakfast, and when they come to us after, we feed them snacks, right? But be generous in your offering. I'm not saying have like a full-on meal, but generous in terms of, instead of saying, here, go grab yourself a snack over there, you, the adult, grab the snack and say, look, I got this really yummy snack for you. What are we doing when we're doing that? Can that child get up and go grab it himself? Sure. But what are we doing when we're saying, here, let me provide for you? It says to the child, this is safe. Oh, I can depend on this person. I can rely on them, right? So there's so many ways that we could do this. Let's see the second one and the third one. Sameness and, I got a minute left. Sameness and belonging, okay? Around second year of age, when the child is able to attach by being with, now they want to attach by being like. My 2-year-old right now is right in the middle of that. My husband sent me a picture on Facebook the other day. He was at home, I was at work. So this is a picture of my 2-year-old wearing my husband's black skin cap, his sunglasses, his earphones, because when he's on the computer, he's always listening to music, and his set of keys in his hand. The kid was ready to go out the door and looking just like daddy. So that's sameness. How can we use this with our after-school kids? Go for the things we have in common, the foods we like, the activities we like to do. Oh, we have the same hair color or the same taste in food or whatever it is. Use sameness to invite them to attach to you. Belonging, how can we foster a sense of belonging? The way we talk to them. We say their names, right? We don't say, hey, you. We say, come here, I don't know, Matthew or whatever. I've got something for you. We use vocabulary that evokes belonging. You're mine, my this, my that, you're my little helper. And we do all these things that way to invite them to belong. And when they're attached to us at the level of belonging, the beauty of that is that then they want to please. So it's much easier to direct a child that is attached to you than a child who is not. Now you'll find in your handbooks, because we won't be able to get all the way to the end, 3 strategies that you can use to foster and cultivate a context of attachment in the work that you do with the kids that you work with, okay? The first one is called collecting. Collecting simply means getting a child's eyes, a smile, and a nod. And if we cannot get that child's eyes for cultural reasons, or the child's too shy or defended, we can go for the ears. So how do we collect? We simply get into the child's space and comment on something that they're interested in, that they like to do, something they're wearing. And the idea is to get them to sort of look at us or listen to us if we can't get the eyes, get a smile out of them, and a nod. So if I say, oh, hi, Frankie, you're wearing your Minion shirt today. You sure love those Minions, don't you? That's all it takes. Neuroscientifically speaking, what you're doing is you've just triggered instincts to attach. The brain is going, woo, I like this. Let's attach this person. So you can collect the child by greeting them in. When you need the child to do something, collect them before you direct. Get those eyes, smiles, and nods before you tell them it's time to put the toys away or the activity away. There's many ways that you can do this. Bridging, children really, especially immature children or stuck children, really struggle with separation. So at the end of the program, if you're the home base, if you're the safe place and they're leaving that program, doesn't matter how old they are or how independent they look, this is going to be a separation for them. And when we're facing separation more than we can bear, we start defending. And maybe you've seen this in children. When you see them the next day, you had a wonderful time with them the day before, you see them the next day, it's like they don't care about you anymore. It might simply be what we call defensive detachment. There's a way we can avoid this. We can bridge. We can, instead of saying goodbye, we say, I'll see you then. We will be doing this together. I can't wait. I look forward to. So the child is facing what? The next connection. instead of separation, right? And we can do this with behavior if we have to manage behavior or discipline. And that's the best advice I can give you today. Don't leave it with the incident management. Don't leave it with the discipline. Bridge it. But we're okay now. I'm still your best bud, or whatever it is that you need to say to the child. I'm still your teacher. I'm still your mentor. I still look forward to doing this with you later. Why? Because we don't want that discipline to be a separation. We don't want that to come in between, to break the relationship, basically. So we can bridge goodbyes, we can bridge physical separation, we can bridge discipline, we can bridge behavior. If the child misbehaved, oh, that was a bad word, Johnny. You know you're not supposed to use that word here, but I get you're frustrated right now. I'll help you with that. Just remember that that's not the kind of word we use here. And I still look forward to playing that game, that card game with you later. So we're bridging bad behavior. The last one, the matchmaking one, and you do this already instinctively. If you're the home base, if you're the safe place, and you need to introduce someone new to the child, make those introductions through yourself. This is my friend, Nora. She loves pizza too, you know, and she's really great at drawing, if that's an interest or a liking of the child. I'm not saying this is Nora. She's a student doing her master's in social work, and you'll see you'll have fun with her. I'm not introducing roles. I'm introducing a person through sameness, through liking. And if that student and child likes me, they're attached to me, at least at the level of belonging, then they're going to like Nora because I like her. So this is called matchmaking. So there's 3 other routes that we won't have an opportunity to get into today, but this 3 first stages of attachment is what we call a working attachment, and this is definitely what you can focus on in the work that you do with students. So keep in mind, it's not so much what we do, but who we are that matters most. If your number 1 preoccupation and intervention is attachment, everything else will eventually fall into place for that child. You might not be the one to harvest the fruit of that attachment, but someone else will down the road. And I can guarantee you in 10, 15, 20 years from now, when we ask that child, what made a difference in your lives? It might be your name that comes up. Thank you.